Thank you guys for tuning in today, and welcome to another episode of The Source, where we interview whistleblowers or researchers, policy experts, or former insiders. I'm your host, Zan Raza, and today we'll be talking to Dr. Shir Hever, an independent economist, author, and journalist. Shir's last book is called The Privatization of Israeli Security. Shir, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Zane.
I want to begin with a topic that is making headlines worldwide: the death of George Floyd, which sparked domestic and international outrage and movements that are calling an end to police brutality and racism. An angle that receives little attention is the US-Israel police cooperation, as well as the militarization of police force. This also includes commercial players behind it who profit from the ever-increasing militarization and use of lethal equipment. Could you talk about this aspect and what your research was able to uncover?
Right. So the problem of militarization of police is a very widespread problem, and the whole idea that the way to deal with crimes, with crime or social unrest, is to increase the power of the police is a very problematic way of thinking about social problems, instead of dealing with the source of the problem and the social injustice that causes people to become mired in poverty and debt. And become desperate. So the relationship between the United States and Israel in that regard traces back to around the time of September 11, when Israeli companies, which were at the time promoting the kind of technologies that they have perfected against Palestinians during the second Intifada that was raging at the time, were then offering that to the United States to outfit the new ministry that was set up in the United States, the Ministry of Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security. And this department had a budget that grew exponentially. Within a matter of a few years, it was bigger than the entire defense budget of the UK. And what are they going to do with all that money? So one of the things they wanted to do with this money is not just to buy to hire staff and to arm that staff with weapons, but also to hire consultants. And that's where we see this cooperation beginning. In 2003, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which is an organization, a human rights organization, basically, based in the United States, dedicated to promoting the struggle against racism, specifically against anti-Semitism. But over the years, it has become more and more an organization just to become another lobby group for Israeli interests and for pro-Zionist interests. The Anti-Defamation League has a history of supporting African-American struggle during the civil rights movement in the 60s, where they marched alongside Martin Luther King. And now they've turned 180 degrees. And in 2003, they started funding cooperations and conferences for U.S. police to work together with Israeli police. Now, this was under the umbrella of teaching the police force how to be sensitive and how to operate in a society with racial minorities, religious minorities, and so on. But when the U.S. officers went to study in Israel or invited Israeli officers to teach in the United States, that was not the topic. The topic was redefined as counterterrorism, because that's how the Israeli experts see themselves. They don't see themselves as outreach civil workers trying to help Palestinians in Palestine be safer and live a better life. Absolutely not. They consider every Palestinian to be a potential terrorist and a potential threat, and they consider themselves to be counterterrorism experts. And in those conferences, the Israeli experts teach how to shoot with deadly accuracy and how to respond very quickly to the tiniest sign of threat. And then we start to see a series of worrying things. Now, we have to be very careful here not to jump into conclusions. I don't want to say that the Israeli police has trained the American police to kill African Americans. That is not accurate. But there are certain things that we can trace. We can see, for example, starting from 2006, activists, international activists, Israeli activists, and Palestinian activists in the West Bank started to report that the Israeli soldiers and the Israeli border guard, which is a branch of the police, have been tackling activists, throwing them on the ground, and then leaning on their neck with the knee. There are a lot of pictures of that specific move that was repeated by so many soldiers. This is specifically the move that we saw in the video of the killing of George Floyd. So we don't know if this was taught to the Minneapolis police, but we can see a certain pattern of similarity. And I think the most important similarity is not the choreography of brutality and how exactly the police officer stands on the neck of or sits on the neck of the detained person, but rather the similarity is in this sort of mentality, as if the neighborhood is a war zone, and as if the police officer is a counterterrorism expert, and they're walking around armed and just waiting for a split-second decision. And somebody could pull out a phone from their pocket, but they would immediately think that was a gun and open fire. That's exactly what happened 2 days after the killing of George Floyd in the old city of Jerusalem, where Iyad al-Halak, who's a Palestinian, was a young Palestinian man with autism. And every day he walked to the treatment center where he received treatment. This time, a bunch of Israeli border guards, so these people who are between police and military, the epitomized militarization of police, just started open firing at him. And he ran away, he begged for his life, he cowered, and they killed him with a series of shots, claiming that he carried a gun. There was no gun. Then one of the last words of Iyad al-Halak were to call out for the therapist, the woman who was working in that center, who usually takes him on that tour to the treatment center. And on that particular day, she was not close enough to him, but she rushed to the scene when she heard the gunfire. And one of his last words were, "I'm with her, I'm with her." And then the police immediately arrested her and asked her, "Where's the gun?" And of course, there was no gun, but they stripped her naked in order to search for a gun that was never there. And that scene, which was just 2 days after the killing of George Floyd, evokes so many similarities, but there are also many differences. The biggest difference, in my opinion, is that the officer who killed George Floyd, he was identified, and he is most likely going to face serious legal consequences, and not just being fired, but probably going to be tried for manslaughter or for murder. The Israeli border police who murdered Iyad al-Halak, their names are kept secret by the government. They're not going to be investigated. They're not going to be arrested. They're not going to be even fired from their jobs. Nothing is going to happen to them, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of similar cases in Palestine and in the United States, but there's still a difference, because the difference is George Floyd, at the very least, was a citizen. He had some rights, and Palestinians don't have that.
You talk about differences. One of the things that comes to mind is at this juncture, when the state is not transparent and fails to hold people accountable, the role of journalism is supposed to play a role in it, in making sure that injustices like this receive adequate attention. However, we saw with George Floyd, and I think it's a great thing that the media worldwide paid attention to it and everything. The question I ask is, and I don't want to compare injustices here, I just want to compare coverages here. When things like this happen in Palestine, is your feeling that the media does not provide adequate attention? And what is your speculation as to why, when certain things like this happen in Palestine, it does not receive the same coverage?
I don't know if I agree with you on that point, because I think that wherever the case is, it's not a question of how much coverage these things get, but rather what type of coverage. So if you look at the amount of coverage, Jerusalem is the city with the second biggest number of journalists in one city in the world. Number one is Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of international attention to what's happening in Jerusalem. And of course, in the old city, it's not so easy for the camera crews to be there. And when you have automatic gunfire around you, then people are not so likely to whip up their phones and take out that video. So we don't have a video of the killing of Iyad al-Halak like we have of the killing of George Floyd. But that's not because journalists don't want to cover it. The problem is that in certain countries, the way that you can cover Israel-Palestine is very restricted. So, for example, in Germany, where German journalists are covering a story like that, they would always make sure to get a response from the Israeli government, representative of the Israeli side. They rarely bother, if ever, to get a response from the Palestinian side. So that creates a very slanted coverage. It's not lack of coverage, it's just very bad coverage. We know that when in 2014, there was the murder of 2 Jewish Israeli colonists in the West Bank, and which is the start of the plot of the HBO show Our Boys, which became a very successful show. So maybe some people remember that event because of that. The thing is that there were journalists from all over the world in the media rooms of the Israeli television as they were covering that event. Everyone in that room knew that the 2 kidnapped colonists are dead. That was clear. And everybody saw the prime minister going on television and saying, we're going to find them, we're going to rescue them, and meeting with the mother of these 2 and lying to her and telling her, your son is still safe, we're going to find him. That not even one journalist from all of that group decided to just break the story. So in Israel, there is military censorship on media. If an Israeli journalist would say, actually, I know that they're already dead, that journalist will be put in jail. So I can understand why the Israeli journalists didn't want to report it. They were afraid. But why did the international journalists not report it? There is no censorship on the German media, on the French media, on the US media. They could have reported if they wanted to. Maybe they would be then lose their press card in Israel and would have to leave and go to some other country, and they probably didn't want that. But I still think that this is a place where you have to look for journalism integrity.
Perhaps we disagree on that fact, but I am an avid follower of the Tagesschau. And yes, sometimes they report on Palestinian atrocities, but it is, in my opinion, it does not receive this continuous coverage that we are seeing up to now for George Floyd, which in my opinion, I don't want to compare, but I want to say it's a good thing that George Floyd's and police brutality and also structural racism is getting so much attention. I think that's one of the things that I see missing when somebody dies, for example, from sniper fire in Israel, that there's not a continuous coverage on the biggest stations I'm talking about.
Yeah, you said Palestinian atrocities, and actually when there are Palestinian atrocities, when Palestinians blow up a bus, which is very rare in the last 10 years, almost, then it is on the Tagesschau actually. But Israeli atrocities don't get coverage on the Tagesschau. Israeli atrocities that can happen pretty much every week, where civilians, defenseless civilians, are being killed. Yeah, that is not on the news, or only it's on the corner of the news. It's a choice, because I'm sure that the Tagesschau and other channels, they have their people on the ground. They get all the information. They are subscribing to Reuters, to AP. The information comes in every day. They make a choice. This is not interesting enough. And there are other places in the world where killing is happening all the time, like in Afghanistan or in Syria, and in those areas also, because it's routine, they choose to report it only very infrequently.
I think it's a very good point that you make with it's not just frequency, but also type of coverage. And I think that's a very good media analysis to make. I want to switch gears here, though. In July, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promised that he's beginning to annex large part of the occupied West Bank. There's also reports that the Israeli military has already declared that it's beginning preparations. Could you provide some context to this move in light of also his corruption case, and thereafter talk about its scope and significance?
Well, Yeah, it's a very big thing. And I think the first thing I have to say, we are recording this in the middle of June. And the annexation is scheduled to happen on July 1st, in 2 weeks. A lot of people think that there's going to be an annexation happening on July 1st. But if that happens, that will be the first time in history that Prime Minister Netanyahu told the truth. Because he said it's going to be July 1st, but he never managed to tell the truth in the past. So I'm going to wait and see, and I don't want to make predictions that are going to turn out wrong. But I do think that we have to break it up a bit. This is a very complex issue. First of all, the most important question is, why does the Israeli public, the people who vote for Netanyahu, and also for the other parties, for most of the Zionist parties, why do they want annexation? Because there is already occupation. Every Palestinian in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip is under complete control over by the Israeli government, by the Israeli military. Their data is in biometric databases. Every step they take is surveilled and recorded. What more do the Israelis want? Is it about land? But the Israelis already control the land. Is it about water? That doesn't matter when we talk about annexation. I think it's about symbolic control and humiliation. It's about taking this opportunity to crush the Palestinian resistance, not just on a physical level, which you could say has already happened because the Palestinians are under occupation, but also to crush them on a symbolic level so much that the Israelis could finally have that feeling that the conflict is over, because the Palestinians have been completely destroyed politically, not physically, not all of them killed, but politically they have no more entity to them. This is complete fantasy. Okay, this is not going to happen. It doesn't matter if Israel says that it annexes and says that the empire of Israel is now controls the whole planet. It doesn't change the fact that Palestinians are going to continue to struggle for their freedom as they did before. But the Israelis want to dream. They want to dream that they can have that moment. And that's what Netanyahu is selling them. So Netanyahu is selling it to them because for him, this is a very crucial moment. Netanyahu is tried for several corruption cases. The evidence against him is overwhelming, and he has done everything to postpone, delay, and try to get the trial not to begin or to begin later. That's what this is really about, and because he knows that he cannot prove his innocence in any way, that his guilt is very clear. Even the state attorney, Avichai Mandelblit, he's a good friend of him, and waited for 3 years before pressing charges. But eventually he had to press charges because the entire state attorney office said, what are you doing with all the files we've been sending you? It has to go further. But Netanyahu is now trying to fight this trial on two levels. And that's why I think it's very interesting, not just for people in Israel and Palestine, but also for people around the world. Because Netanyahu is very similar to a lot of populist right-wing leaders, whether it's Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil or Narendra Modi in India or Donald Trump in the United States. You can say one thing about all these people: they're right-wing, they're populist, and they're corrupt. And it goes together. And how do these people fight against corruption? By saying that the courts, not against corruption. How do they defend their corruption? By saying that the courts are left-wing. They go after the court, they go after the police, and they go after the media. And that's exactly what Netanyahu is doing. Netanyahu says, this whole court case against me is actually a conspiracy to prevent the annexation. Palestinians and the judges are forming one group to try to get rid of me because I'm the only one who can annex the West Bank. And this is a very crazy sounding conspiracy theory, but Netanyahu is using that as his defense strategy on the popular level, while at the same time inside the courthouse he has waging a completely different strategy and trying to win his court case by different means, mainly by dragging it for as long as possible, because after so many years of trial, it's expected to last between 3 and 5 years. He hopes that the court will say, well, nobody cares about this anymore, and will drop the whole thing. But so that's his legal strategy. But the populist strategy is very important. So when we talk about annexation, we really have to understand that for Netanyahu, it's a purely symbolic thing. For the Israeli public, it's a purely symbolic thing. It's the ability to plant the flag and say this is ours on a territory that's already under their control. But we also have to remember that it is something that could affect the lives of thousands of Palestinians. Because it's not going to just be the same thing for the thousands of Palestinians, especially in the Jordan Valley, in Area C, areas that are extremely important for the Palestinian economy, because these are the most fertile agricultural areas. There are a lot of farms there. And Palestinians have been living on those farms for many generations, but the Israeli military government in the occupied territory keeps a registry of who owns which piece of land, and they keep casting doubt and saying, we don't believe that this land is really yours, even though who knows how many generations you've lived there, but maybe it's not really your land. As soon as they can say this land is not directly a private land of somebody, then they can confiscate it and say it's state land. And the Israeli legal interpretation of what state land means, it means they can build colonies for Jews only in that area and then turn it into private land again, which is a very odd interpretation, but this is how colonialism works. Now, there is a law inside Israel, which is called the absentee property law. And this is a law which was used after the Nakba, after the deportation of Palestinian refugees in 1948, to take over the property that was left behind. The absentee property law says if somebody is absent from the state, and if that somebody happens to be an enemy of the state, meaning a Palestinian, then the property is going to be held by a trustee, and the trustee will only give the property back when that person returns. But Palestinians are not allowed to return. And then a lot of Palestinian absentees who were internally displaced people, internal refugees. They didn't leave Israel after the war, but they had to leave their homes, and they came back to their homes. And when they tried to come back to their home, the army said, no, it's not yours anymore, because it was confiscated under the absentee property law. And they said, but I'm not absentee, I'm present, I'm here. And then they were defined as present absentees, which is another funny little, sad and funny little colonial logic to you. But this is a problem for the Israeli authorities in the West Bank, because that's not part of Israel, and they cannot use the absentee property law. So all of these farmers, they still face attempts to confiscate their land and to build colonies on their land and to demolish their homes. But they can always appeal to the court, and there's always some kind of process that it can slow down the confiscation of the land. Once there is annexation, the government can say, well, now the absentee property law applies to the entire area that was annexed. It's part of Israel now. So people living in that farm for 10 generations, they're present absentees, and their property can be confiscated.
Shir Hever, independent economic researcher, author, and journalist, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Zain.
And thank you guys for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the bell below, and to donate so we can continue to produce independent and non-profit news and analysis. I'm your host, Zain Raza. See you guys next time.